They found the first box by accident. A shovel struck something hollow beneath the floor of a collapsed slave cabin, and the sound that came back was not wood, not stone, but empty. An emptiness that had waited more than a century to be heard. The plantation was supposed to be clean land. Surveyed, accounted for, logged in parish records as cleared. But the earth beneath it disagreed. This was Louisiana, 1912. A humid morning, thick with insects and the smell of rot rising from old river mud. A logging crew had been sent to dismantle what remained of the cabin's structures no one wanted to preserve, and no one wanted to remember. They were there to erase history, not uncover it. The box was small, hand-cut, no markings, no name. It was buried directly beneath the hearth. When they opened it, every man present stepped back at once, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt. A pressure, a tightening in the chest, a sensation like being watched from inside the object itself. Inside the box was a single item, the same item that would later be found beneath every slave cabin on the property. The same item that parish authorities quietly ordered, reburied. The same item church leaders warned should never be displayed. And the same item that disappeared from public record entirely by 1921. This documentary is not about folklore. It is not about ghost stories told to scare children. It is about a pattern, a buried system, and an object that appears again and again in places where suffering was once institutionalized and where silence became policy. Because some histories are not forgotten. They are contained. The land was once called Belle Rêve Noire, Black Dream. It never appeared under that name in official documents. On maps, it was simply another sugar plantation along the river, productive, profitable, unremarkable. Its owners changed names, its ledgers were clean, its taxes were paid on time. But oral histories told a different story. Formerly enslaved families spoke of cabins where prayer was forbidden, of night sermons whispered into dirt floors, of elders who vanished after refusing to kneel. Belle Rêve Noire was not known for cruelty in the traditional sense. There were no public whippings recorded, no mass graves discovered nearby. What made it different was something far quieter. Order. Obedience was unnaturally consistent. Runaways were rare. Rebellions non-existent. Church records from nearby parishes noted something strange. Baptismal requests from the plantation were almost always denied, not because they weren't Christian, but because the enslaved people there refused to recite certain vows. Specifically, vows concerning confession. When emancipation came, families left quickly. They did not linger. They did not reclaim land. They did not return to bury their dead. The cabins remained untouched for decades. Locals said animals avoided them. Children said the floors felt warm even in winter. And older residents, those who still remembered the plantation, refused to walk between the rows. When the first buried box was uncovered, the foreman assumed it was a charm, a folk relic, something meant to ward off spirits. But when the second box was found beneath another cabin, same depth, same orientation, same contents, the mood shifted. By the 10th box, the men refused to dig further. And by the 23rd, the sheriff was called. The object inside each box was identical. Not similar. Not symbolic. Identical. A small, carved figure made from dark, dense wood, possibly cypress, possibly something older, roughly the size of a human hand. No facial features, only an elongated head bowed slightly forward. Its arms were bound to its sides with grooves carved deep into the wood, as if restraints had been intentionally fused into the body. On its chest was a symbol. Not African. Not Christian. Not indigenous. It did not match any known iconography from the region. Every figure faced west. Every box was lined with ash. And every figure bore faint scratches, dozens of them too uniform to be accidental. The sheriff documented the finds, photographed them, logged them as ritual artifacts of unknown origin. He sent 3 figures to the parish archive for review. 2 weeks later, the archive burned. The fire was ruled accidental. The figures were never recovered. Church correspondence from that same month includes a brief, chilling note from a diocesan official. Objects recovered beneath former servant quarters are not to be discussed. They represent a misunderstanding of spiritual authority best left buried. No further explanation was given. The remaining boxes were ordered sealed back into the ground. No press. No inquiry. But not before one of the workers took a figure home. His name was never recorded. Only what happened to him afterward. The worker lived 3 miles from the site in a one-room house near the river. He brought the figure home wrapped in cloth, telling his wife it was just a carving. That night, neither of them slept. Not because of nightmares. Because neither of them could close their eyes. They described a sensation of pressure in the room as if the air itself had weight. The figure, placed on a shelf, seemed to darken as the hours passed, not moving, not changing position, just absorbing. By morning, the man was shaking. By the second night, he began whispering apologies to no one. On the third day, neighbors found him standing waist-deep in the river, holding the figure out in front of him, begging it to stay quiet. He was committed to a state hospital by the end of the week. Doctors noted extreme insomnia, paranoia, and a recurring phrase written again and again in his intake notes. "It listens when we kneel." The figure was confiscated. Where it went next is unclear. But the plantation was abandoned soon after. The cabins were dismantled. The land was sold, divided, renamed, and yet decades later during highway construction, during drainage projects, during foundation work for new homes, they kept finding the boxes, always beneath where the cabins once stood, always with the same object inside, and always, after discovery, someone would quietly arrive to make sure it disappeared again. There is no official record of the church's involvement. That absence is the first sign something was deliberately removed. Within days of the sheriff's report, a small delegation arrived at Belle Reve Noire. These men wore no insignia, carried no Bibles in their hands, and did not pray aloud. Witnesses later described them as administrators. They spoke softly. They asked precise questions. They measured the ground. One elderly woman remembered one of them kneeling at the edge of a former cabin site, not in prayer, but in listening. His ear pressed to the soil, as if expecting a response. Church correspondence from Baton Rouge around this time references a quiet initiative called the Custodial Doctrine. It is described vaguely as a containment effort for misaligned spiritual practices among dependent populations. The phrase, dependent populations, appears repeatedly. Enslaved people, orphans, the poor, the institutionalized. The doctrine emphasized obedience over salvation, silence over confession, stability over truth. It warned of something called residual will, a belief that extreme, repeated submission could imprint itself onto places, objects, even land. The figures, according to a single surviving memo, were not idols. They were anchors. Between 1,870 and 1,910, at least 6 orphanages were established within a 50-mile radius of Belle Reve Noire. All were church-affiliated. All accepted children without documentation. All reported unusually low instances of rebellion, escape, or disciplinary incidents. Mortality rates were never alarming, just high enough to be accepted. What was unusual were the construction records. Beneath each dormitory wing, beneath kitchens and prayer rooms, workers were instructed to dig narrow pits before foundations were poured. These pits were marked in blue chalk, then crossed out in final plans. Former caretakers, interviewed decades later, never move the boxes, never open them, never ask why they were there. One caretaker confessed that when a box was accidentally uncovered during plumbing repairs, the supervising priest did not call the bishop. He called someone else. The box was removed within the hour. The children were made to kneel all night. By the early 1920s, the figures had appeared in 3 states. Always beneath sites of forced obedience. Always buried before construction, never after. Always identical. A suppressed anthropological report never published, only circulated privately, offered a disturbing hypothesis. The figures were not meant to influence people. They were meant to collect something already present. Fear. Submission. Unspoken resentment. The report suggests that prolonged exposure to enforced obedience creates a psychological residue, an imprint of suppressed will. The figures, placed beneath living spaces, absorbed this residue over time, concentrating it. Why? The report ends abruptly, missing its final pages. But scribbled in the margin of one copy is a sentence written in a different hand. What is gathered must be buried again, or it will learn to answer. In 1923, a small rural church near the old plantation rang its bells continuously for 6 hours. No one was inside. When locals forced the doors open, they found the sanctuary empty, except for a single wooden figure placed at the altar, facing west. The bells stopped the moment it was removed. By morning, the figure was gone. The priest resigned the same week. He never gave a sermon again. Church officials dismissed the incident as vandalism. But construction logs show that the church had been built directly over a former slave cabin site. And beneath its foundation, inspectors later found an empty pit. The box had been removed. Whatever it once contained had been allowed to surface. Not everyone agreed to keep the secret. By the late 1920s, word of the figures had begun to leak not publicly, but privately, through families who discovered them while clearing land or repairing old structures. These families shared one trait in common. They did not belong to the church. In one recorded case, a farming family outside Street Martin Parish uncovered a box beneath their kitchen floor. Inside was the familiar figure, its surface darker than any previously described, its grooves worn smooth as if touched repeatedly. The father ordered it burned. Witnesses reported that the fire would not take. Dry wood hissed. Flames collapsed inward. Smoke smelled sour, metallic, wrong. When the figure was finally thrown into the river, the family slept for the first time in weeks. 2 days later, the river flooded out of season and deposited the figure back onto their land, clean and undamaged. The family moved within the month. Their house was later purchased by a church-affiliated charity and converted into a boarding home. The box was reburied. By 1931, internal memos show coordination between churches, charitable foundations, and state-run institutions. Mental hospitals, reform schools, workhouses, facilities built on former plantations were quietly prioritized for expansion funding. Construction guidelines, unofficial, never published, recommended foundational stabilizers be placed beneath dormitories and chapels. Contractors were paid extra for silence. Patients in these facilities displayed a pattern. Compliance without improvement. They obeyed. They labored. They prayed. But they did not recover. Doctors described an emotional flattening. A submission so complete it erased resistance but left suffering intact. One physician resigned after writing, "We are not treating illness. We are preserving it." The figures remained buried. The system endured. In 1938, a schoolteacher named Eleanor Graves moved into a restored plantation home with her husband. She was educated, skeptical, and meticulous. When she found a sealed pit beneath the nursery, she documented everything. She opened the box. For 3 nights afterward, Eleanor reported hearing whispering, not voices, but responses. As if questions she never spoke were being answered anyway. She wrote obsessively in her journals, pages filled with the same phrase, "It does not command. It remembers." On the 4th night, she dreamed of kneeling crowds, faces blurred, mouths closed, while the figures were passed among them like communion. Eleanor attempted to publish her findings. Her manuscript was rejected without explanation by 6 publishers. She was later diagnosed with hysterical delusions and committed to a sanitarium built on former plantation land. Her journals disappeared. The figure was returned to the ground. Something changed after 1940. Construction crews reported empty pits where boxes were supposed to be. Churches quietly reinforced foundations. Administrators expressed concern not that the figures were being found, but that they were missing. A confidential letter from 1,944 states. Containment requires burial. Exposure accelerates agency. The implication was terrifying. The figures were no longer dormant. They had absorbed enough. In places where boxes were missing, residents reported unrest, sleeplessness, sudden defiance, confessions spilling uncontrollably from people who had been silent their entire lives. One orphanage closed after children began refusing to kneel. Another burned after staff claimed the walls were listening. The system had depended on the figures remaining buried. But someone had begun removing them. And whatever had been contained for generations was starting to surface. The removals were not random. By tracing missing boxes across parishes, investigators working decades later noticed a pattern. The boxes disappeared only from sites where records had begun to surface, where letters were copied, where journals survived, where someone had started asking the wrong questions. The removals occurred at night. No forced entry. No witnesses. In one case, a groundskeeper swore he saw 3 men digging beneath a chapel by lantern light. They wore plain coats, their faces hidden not by hoods but by shadow, unnaturally deep shadow, as if light refused to touch them fully. When confronted, one of the men spoke only a single sentence. "We are reducing pressure." By morning, the pit was empty. The church never reported theft. Because it was not theft. It was retrieval. Hidden beneath a theological seminary outside New Orleans was a sub-basement not listed on blueprints. Accessed through a false wall behind old confessionals, it contained shelves, hundreds of them lined with the same wooden figures, each labeled only with a date and location. Not where they were found. Where they were filled. A surviving inventory ledger smuggled out by a maintenance worker in 1951 listed quantities, saturation levels, and something called load instability. One margin note read, "When collective submission exceeds tolerance, relocation is required. Do not allow aggregation." The figures were not meant to be gathered together. They were meant to be spread. Like weight. Like debt. Like guilt. Some asked why the figures weren't destroyed. The answer appears in a single theological brief, marked restricted. It argued that obedience, once collected, cannot be annihilated, only transferred. To destroy a saturated figure would be to release everything it contained at once. Confession without structure. Memory without narrative. Pain without ritual. The brief warned of spiritual inversion, a moment when institutions lose authority, not through rebellion, but through uncontrollable truth. So the figures were buried. Moved. Redistributed. Better to let obedience remain underground than allow it to speak. By the late 1940s, the system began to fracture. Church attendance declined sharply in areas with heavy box redistribution. Workers quit en masse from institutions once known for docility. Survivors began telling stories not in anger, but with eerie calm. They remembered kneeling. They remembered silence. They remembered feeling something beneath their feet. One rural courthouse collapsed after renovations removed a foundation box. The official cause was structural error, but a clerk who escaped the collapse told reporters, "It felt like the building exhaled." Internal memos spoke openly now of containment failure. The pressure was too high. Too many boxes had been filled, and there was nowhere left to bury them safely. In 1949, a coordinated effort began. Dozens of figures were removed from seminaries, orphanages, and hospitals and transported south into the wetlands, where records dissolve and foundations sink. No buildings were erected over them. No people housed above them. They were buried deep, alone. The final ledger entry reads, "Load dispersed. Authority preserved." The program ended quietly. Files were sealed. Participants reassigned. And the land was allowed to forget. But forgetting is not the same as erasure. Every figure faced west. This detail was never explained in official documents, only noted again and again as if repetition itself could substitute for understanding. West was where the sun died each day, where light retreated, where the future was supposed to be. But for the people who lived above those buried boxes, West was also where they had been sent. Sold west. Worked west. Disappeared west. The orientation was not symbolic. It was directional. A suppressed field note from 1952 proposes that the figures were aligned not to the land, but to movement. To the path of forced displacement. To the route obedience traveled when bodies were relocated but submission remained behind. The figures were listening devices not for sound, but for history repeating itself. And when they filled, they were turned westward, to release what they had gathered back into the same current that created it. In 1961, during levee repairs after severe flooding, workers uncovered a box far deeper than any before. It was not beneath a building. It was beneath open ground. No cabin. No church. No institution. Just earth. The box was heavier than expected. The figure inside was nearly black, its surface polished smooth as stone. The grooves binding its arms were worn away, almost erased. One worker later said it felt warm. The box was reported. No one came. For the first time in over 50 years, no authority arrived to reclaim it. The box sat in a parish storage shed for 3 days. During that time, 3 men quit their jobs without explanation. One began writing letters to people he had not spoken to in decades. Another stood in the river at night, watching the current as if waiting for instructions. On the 4th day, the box was gone. No break-in. No record. No transfer. It simply was no longer there. Today, construction crews still find them rarely, quietly. Boxes beneath schools. Beneath parking lots. Beneath homes built long after the institutions disappeared. Sometimes they are empty. Sometimes they are not. The figures are always facing west. What was collected over generations, obedience forced, silence enforced, suffering ritualized, was never destroyed. Only delayed. Compressed. Stored beneath the weight of everyday life. And pressure does not disappear. It waits. If this story feels unsettling, it is because it is not about the past. It is about systems that learned how to bury consequences instead of confronting them. About how silence can be engineered. How submission can be harvested. How institutions survive by teaching people to kneel before they learn to speak. The boxes were never meant to be permanent. They were meant to buy time. And time, eventually, runs out. If you ever find yourself standing on land that feels too quiet, if the ground beneath your feet feels warm when it shouldn't, if something buried seems to be listening, remember this: some histories do not want to be remembered. They want to be released.